I graduated with 325 other Muskogee Oklahomans back in 1994. If you have heard of the Merle Haggard song, "I'm an Okie from Muskogee," well, that's where I grew up. And if I understand correctly, there were nearly 600 who started out my freshman year. Graduated with 325. There's a lesson there about perseverance. One of the sweet young ladies that I graduated with had a senior speech class with her. Did not know her. Her name was Sarah. And I did not know that Sarah was kind of Oklahoma royalty. As far as, you think of the U.S. and you think of the Kennedys. All you have to say is the Kennedys, and you know who people are talking about when they talk about politics. Well, Sarah was from a family whose dad, Jim Edmondson, maybe you've heard of the last name Edmondson. Jim Edmondson served as a U.S. District Court judge there in the Muskogee area for a number of years until he was appointed to the Oklahoma State Supreme Court back in 2003. Still serving. His term is not up. This term is not up until 2025. Her grandfather was a 10-term U.S. congressman. Served from 1953 to 1973. Her great-uncle was a former U.S. senator as well as an Oklahoma governor. I didn't even know any of that when we were in school together. She was just a nice girl, that I kind of got to know a little bit my senior year because we had a speech class together. But it wasn't long after graduation that Sarah's life changed in a very sad and dramatic way. Sarah had a boyfriend named Benjamin Darris, that she met from Tahlequah. Any people from Tahlequah here today? I know my friend Terrell Hatfield, who's manning the Apologetic Express booth this weekend for us graciously. He's from Tahlequah, nice, great city. I have a nephew or two who lives there. And Benjamin Darris and Sarah met at some kind of party in Tahlequah. Not long after that, they left to go to a Grateful Dead concert in 1995. This was in the spring of 95, I believe it was March. And the story is told in different ways. I've seen it in the news. I've seen it told by John Grisham. You know John Grisham, he wrote a short story about Sarah Edmondson and Benjamin Darris. And so there's two different versions of the story. They arrived too early for the concert or too late for the concert. But, they didn't have, it's not as easy as just taking out your smartphone as it is today and finding out when is the concert. And so they decided, they were going to kill some time, and sadly, they did more than just kill time. They drove south of Memphis to Hernando, Mississippi. 2 miles outside of Hernando, they went into a cotton gin, and Sarah's boyfriend, Benjamin, went inside and sadly shot point blank a man with 2 gunshots to the head and killed him and took his wallet. They continued to travel about 300 miles south of Hernando down to Ponchatoula, Louisiana. And if there's anyone here from Louisiana, I'm sorry if I butchered that name. Went inside, this is Sarah this time, went inside into a convenience store there in Ponchatoula to get some more cash because they had run out of money. And she went inside and fired a shot from a pistol, and she severed the spinal cord of a 35-year-old mother of 3, happily married woman named Patsy Byers. Patsy Byers was a quadriplegic from that point until she died a few years ago, dying of cancer. Sadly, Sarah Edmondson, she was arrested, she was tried, she was convicted and of attempted murder as well as some other things, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Served only 11 of those years until she was paroled several years ago. Her boyfriend, Benjamin, was eventually tried and convicted of the murder of the man outside of Hernando, Mississippi, a murder that John Grisham wrote about because, as I understand it, he lived somewhere in that area. And Benjamin's story it's a heart-wrenching story. You hear these kinds of facts and you think, this is absolutely terrible, what happened, what they did. I was very interested in the story because this was one of the young ladies that I graduated high school with and did not know much about her other than she just seemed like a nice young lady and didn't know anything about Benjamin Darris, who is still serving a life sentence without parole. And I learned I learned a little bit about Benjamin a few years later when I saw it was either a 2020 ABC News special or a Dateline, Nightline, NBC special. I learned a little bit about him then, and then later more from some articles that I read. I probably learned most about Benjamin Darris from a letter that he wrote where he was seeking pardon after about 27 years from the governor of Mississippi. And in that letter, he tells about his life. He talks about, he doesn't give any excuses for why he did what he did. I mean, he really owns up to the heinous crime, the murder that he committed. And he says, in this letter, let me tell you, my story. And he begins to talk about how he grew up in an abusive home with a father who continually was abusive to his mother. And this is what he and his 4 siblings saw. And he said that his mother finally divorced his father when he was 9 years old. And then when he was just a few years older than that, his father wound up committing suicide. And a few years after that, his oldest brother, who had left home when he was 16 years old and ran away, eventually committed suicide as well. Benjamin Darris, from the time he was in the 3rd grade, he began skipping classes. Can you imagine skipping classes in the 3rd grade? I mean, where I grew up, and when I grew up, I just thought, maybe you started doing that in the 7th grade. Maybe you did a little bit of that, but if you had a dad like I had, you didn't skip any classes, because if he ever found out, there was going to be, some big problems. I see Jeff Lemon back there. You know my dad, Brother Jeff, and he's a good man, but you didn't skip classes when you had a dad like I had. Benjamin Darris, from the time he was 3rd grade, he didn't have any real direction in his life. I want to read you a statement that he made to the governor of Mississippi. I wanted to begin this class on parenting with this example. Yes, it is a rather extreme example, I understand. But it certainly shows us the importance of trajectory when it comes to raising children. He said to the governor of Mississippi, he said, at the age of 18, I had accomplished exactly nothing. I had not finished school. Never had a job. Never had a driver's license. Had no close friends. And was slowly beginning to use drugs on a regular basis. He's writing this 27, 28 years later. He's a changed man today, thankfully. He said, I was a person with no dreams, no goals, no hope, and thinking that would never change. Eventually, I just gave up on life completely. I cared little for my own life or for anyone around me. This state of mind, I believe, is what enabled me to take the life of another person. And then he said this. He said, my arrest was almost a relief. And isn't it sad when you find more structure in prison life than in home life? And he found some good role models, believe it or not, and he found some good things in prison. I appreciate those who take an active role in prison ministry. Let me read to you just a few statistics that came from the America First Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group, as well as in conjunction with the Center for Opportunity Now, regarding absent fathers. And these statistics were published in August of last year, so they're fairly recent statistics. Some things I don't know if we are very familiar with as far as some of these percentages. According to their studies, in America right now, there are over 18 million children without a biological father, stepfather, or adopted father in the home. That's 23% of children in the U.S. being reared by a single parent. Now, I understand, and you understand, that there are some situations where there are single parents who are doing the absolute best that they can, and it is no fault of their own why they are in the situation that they are in. I think we also understand how God created the family, how God created a man to be with a woman and a woman to be with a man, and for them to have children if they are blessed with such, whether biological or adopted children, and to be rearing those children with a loving husband and a loving wife. And here's the thing, 23% of children in this country are not being reared by a mom and a dad. And this is what blew my mind, is that this is the highest rate of any country in the world. Now, you know, I am so thankful for the country in which we live, and I am thankful that there have been men and women who have made sacrifices, including the ultimate sacrifice for us to have the freedoms that we have. And I am thankful for many of the Christian-oriented, minded people throughout this country's history who have tried to do and teach some good things. But when I read stats like that, it is very hard for me to think of this country as a Christian nation. 23% of children being raised by a single parent, the highest rate of any country in the world, and is 3 times the world average at 7%. 90% of all homeless and runaway children, 90% of all runaway children and homeless children are from fatherless homes. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions and 85% of youth in prisons come from fatherless homes. Let me read that last part again. 85% of youth in prisons come from fatherless homes. Now again, that's not a sentence for those who do not have biological or adoptive fathers at homes or stepfathers. That doesn't mean that if you are being reared by a single parent or a single mother that it is hopeless. That doesn't mean that at all. But I think we can see that God's plan is for there to be, the ideal plan is for there to be a mother and a father. Fatherless children are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated. I think we need to be teaching and preaching more about being the kind of mothers and fathers that God calls us to be, and to be calling people with the gospel of Christ out of darkness into light, and then having classes for those on parenting and on rearing children. Approximately 85% of children with behavioral disorders come from fatherless homes. This is 20 times the national average. You know, the first point I'd like to make, and if you read the summary of this class, it begins with what the last class in here was about. Is about Christian marriages. It's about moms and dads who love God and love each other to the extent that they are not willing to break the covenant that they have made between their God and themselves in holy, set-apart matrimony. Because the best way, God's Word says it, the statistics bear it out, the best way and God's way to rear children is to have a mom and a dad who love each other like no one else. And so when you read in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4 about fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord, we understand that this falls just a few verses after the paragraph of Ephesians chapter 5 verses 22 through 23 where he is calling husbands and wives, as he is talking about and really doing an amazing thing that, you know, you just give credit to the Holy Spirit for weaving these beautiful teachings of Christ and the church and the husband and the wife. It's so intertwined, these teachings. It's like this author is... He's not human. I mean, he is God. He is all-knowing. He is able to write something and pen something so beautifully as he has taught us something even about the home and the marriage as he's talking about Christ and his beloved church. And he tells men to rise up and be the kind of husbands that God calls you to be. And he says 3 times in Ephesians 5, that you love your wife as you love yourself. He says in Ephesians 5, verse 28, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. It's twice right there in that one verse. In verse 33, he says, so the husband is to love his own wife as himself. Some men may say, well, I don't like the idea of loving myself. Well, you should. I know we live in this narcissistic society of me, myself, and I, and we've raised perhaps more than one generation with the internet and devices and time with these things, where we've sadly allowed so many to become just lovers of themselves in an unhealthy sense. But God does say that there is a healthy sense in which we love ourselves. Don't you take care of yourself? I hope so. I mean, I think it was last night, I'm telling y'all something kind of silly, okay? But I got back to my hotel room and I was talking to my wife on FaceTime. She was pooped after a long week of work. And I started smelling something. I was like, what's that smell? I'm sitting there, no one's in the room at the hotel than me. And I realized it was my feet. They stunk. They were... Now I won't go into all this, but I do have foot problems, and not just stinky feet problems. I've got something called tarsal tunnel syndrome. You've heard of carpal tunnel. I've got it in my feet, and so it's kind of painful a lot of times to stand. And I've also been told I have post-COVID neuropathy, and man, that's not been any fun. And then on top of that, I got stinky feet. Okay, and maybe it's because of the kinds of socks. I wear compression socks a lot because it just kind of helps with the neuropathy issues or whatever. And You know what I did this morning? I made sure when I took a shower today, I probably should have taken one last night, but I made sure that I scrubbed my feet this morning in the shower. I took care of myself. That's the point I'm making. You look in the mirror and you've got something hanging out of your nose, you take care of that, right? If you take care of yourself. Listen, let me tell you what, I rarely make it out to Oklahoma anymore. But when I do, let me tell you what I like to eat. Brahms. I know you may say, Brahms? Oh, yeah, I've already been to Brahms. I think 2 times ago I was in Oklahoma. I think I went to Brahms at least twice. This time I've been once. I might hit it again before I head back to the airport here in a few hours. When I'm hungry, I don't want to get hangry, so I eat, right? I take care of myself. God says, well, you think about yourself. You make sure you think about your wife. You make sure you take care of her. Because God has, as you have made a covenant between God and your wife, you've separated her in this sanctifying type way. You know, God has taken us as Christians out of a world of sin before we were Christians and brought us into His household, to the saved, to the body, to the church. He's called us out of darkness to walk in light. He has hallowed us. He's sanctified us. You know, our self-like love that we have for our wives, men, he says, we have the sanctifying type love where this woman is different than every other woman in the world. She is your woman and you are her man, and God has taken her out and you've made her specially yours. And if you live that kind of life and that kind of marriage as you are rearing children, what is that doing for your children and my children? It's setting an example. It's setting a tone. It's showing them what a real family is supposed to be like. And surely if you treat your wife that way, with self-like love, not narcissistic love, but self-like love and sanctifying love and selfless love, so that you would give, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for her. Gave Himself for her. He would say basically the same thing in Ephesians 5 and verse 2. Loved us and given Himself for us. Or maybe you love the song we sometimes sing that comes straight from Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. And that's the kind of love that God says we are to have for our wives. And listen, men, let me just say from 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, that if we're not dwelling together with our wives with self-like, selfless, sanctifying love, with an understanding heart, and we're not being the kind of husbands that God calls us to be. God tells us there in in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7 that it can interfere with our relationship with God because we are heirs together, amen, of the grace of life. And so let's treat them in a way that glorifies our God, that our prayers, that your prayers may not be hindered. And of course, in a wonderful Christian home, as God would have it, God calls not only men to act this way, but He calls wives to love and respect their husbands. Maybe you're reading from a different translation than the New King James I'm reading out of. In Ephesians 5 and verse 33, we read that you may read from a translation that says she fears her husband, or she reveres her husband. She has this intense, great respect for him. And what woman wouldn't have such a great respect for her husband who loves her the way that God has shown us, exemplified for us in Christ's love for the church, and instructed us to love our wives this way? And when you build a home this way, by the way, this phobeo, this fear or reverence or intense respect that the wife has for her husband, this is not the fearful, kind of the fear of, like Peter was going to drown as he was allowed to walk on the sea for a few moments. It's not that kind of fear. It's not the one-talent man's fear. He was afraid of his master, so he went and hid his talent in the earth. It's not that kind of fear. And it's certainly not the kind of the best, the highest phobeo or reverence that we have for God Almighty. We certainly are not that, men. We don't ever need to act that way. But we have a wife who certainly respects her husband because he is living like the Lord would have him to live. And let me just say this before we move on, because I've probably dealt a little bit more with Ephesians 5, 22 through 33 than maybe I should have. But I would just like to say, husbands and wives, that God calls you and me to be the spouse that I'm called to be regardless of how my wife acts. Now, I'm blessed. Jesus said in John chapter 6 that He came down from heaven, and I think, that was an interesting statement that He made. Can you imagine those who didn't think of Jesus as being God, and He let them know, I came down from heaven? I like to think of my wife as having come down from heaven. She's just the perfect person for me. But, whether she is an angel or not, you know what God calls me to be? A husband who would die for her. A husband who would give it all up for her. And that is the kind of husband that our children need to see. And that's the kind of wife that our children need to see. And I am convinced that when our children see that in the home, that Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4 just kind of comes quite naturally. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture or training or discipline and instruction of the Lord. Let me just read to you a couple of statements regarding the day and time in which Paul was living. So he's writing to the Christians there in Asia Minor, there at Ephesus, and he's writing during a day and time where children had virtually no rights. I think I was in graduate school when I first heard about a letter that was written by a man named Hilarion in 1 BC. In fact, he signed the letter the 29th year of Caesar, the 23rd of Pani, if that's how you pronounce it, which is in late spring. He was writing a letter from Alexandria, Egypt, back home to his wife, and apparently there was maybe a parent or an in-law who was living with them as well as a child. And Hilarion says to his wife, he was down there working in Alexandria, Egypt, don't know exactly what his occupation was, with other men, and he says this to his wife. He says, very many greetings. I don't normally begin my letters to my wife with, many greetings from so-and-so. I'm supposed to be in Africa here in a week, and I doubt I'm going to be emailing my wife and saying, greetings from, it just sounds a little formal, but anyway. And then he goes on and says this. I'll just kind of skip through some of it. He said, I ask you and urge you, look after the child. Apparently they already had one child. As soon as I receive my pay, and I will send it up to you. If by chance you give birth and it's a male, let it live. If it's a female, get rid of it. And then he continues from there and says, how can I forget you? I ask, therefore, you not to be anxious. Like he's showing some care for his wife, but it's, if you have a female child, just get rid of it. which is somewhat similar to the statement that the first century Roman statesman Seneca made that we have preserved for us when dealing with a sick or deformed child. He said, "We slaughter a fierce ox. We strangle a mad dog. We plunge a knife into sickly cattle, lest they taint the herd. Children who are born weakly and deformed, we drown." From a Roman statesman in the first century. Well, Paul begins in this world that he was living in. And I know it's different than the world we live in today, but based on a lot of things that we've seen in this country and around the world, I'm not sure it's a whole lot different. I could show you quotations, read you quotations from atheists who are philosophically, theoretically taking atheism to its logical conclusion. Theoretically. Well, they will say. Just recently I read one that came out, one particular magazine, I think it had to do with, it was a science magazine, and I'm trying to remember the exact branch of science, and it can't recall at this moment in time, but these two individuals were making the case for being able to kill children well after they've been born. And this is what they argue. Well, if we can kill them in the womb up until 9 months, then why isn't the same reasoning so that we could kill them even after they are born? And they even said in the article that if the mother's mental health was more bothered by them giving that child up for adoption than killing the child, they should have the right to end the child's life. So I'm not sure how different. I mean, it's different, but I don't know if it's a whole lot different than even the day and time that Paul was writing to husbands and wives and to mothers and fathers. Do not provoke your children to wrath. Does that sound like something very different than if you want to treat your child like a slave, then you can? You know, oftentimes when we quote this verse and we deal with this text, oftentimes it's the latter part of the text that we deal with. And for a few more minutes, I would like to just camp out here on this thought of do not provoke your children to wrath. Some translations say anger, but really it is an intense anger, which is probably why some translations, a number of them use this word wrath. Because I realize you might take something away from a child. Last night I saw, it was so funny, we were eating in the dinner in the gymnasium, and one brother and his sweet wife, they had a precious child sitting in between them, and she was the little, probably less than 1 year old, had a spoon that she was, getting in those taters and feeding herself a little bit, and the father, I'm trying to remember his name, I just saw him a second ago, he tried to take the spoon away from her, and she was not having it, okay? I realized that child, finally he was like, well, we're about to have somebody come speak up here, we'll just let the child have the spoon, that's perfectly all right? But the fact is, there are real ways that fathers can fail and mothers can fail by driving our kids to a level of anger that would not be there otherwise. I'm not saying that children, you and I know that children can become angry for unrighteous reasons. But I would say, number one, let's not provoke our children to wrath by foolishly being overly harsh and bitter and upset with them about foolish things or even legitimate things that we need to teach our children, but let's not move them to a level of intense anger because of our impatient and foolish and immature parenting. I'm reminded, in fact, I printed out this article. This is not against Alabama fans. Y'all really, I do root for Alabama pretty much as long as they're not playing Oklahoma for the most part. You know what happened 20 years ago? You can read this on ESPN, by the way. I just printed it off the other day. I remembered the story, but I wanted to make sure I heard the story right. Alabama lost to Arkansas. That hasn't happened a whole lot in recent years, but lost to Arkansas with a double overtime loss, having, I think, blown like a 14 or 17 point fourth quarter lead. Y'all, Oklahoma fans are serious. I get Oklahoma State fans, Oklahoma fans. I get it. Alabama fans, it's a different world out there. I've been living in Alabama for the last 22 years. It's a different world. I live 45 minutes from Auburn. Never been to Auburn game. I'd like to go at some point, but I got to go to the Oklahoma-Alabama game in Tuscaloosa a few years ago. But you know what happened in one family? There was a father who was so upset about Alabama losing. This is another extreme example. I get it. That his son could see how upset he was and just decided to, his 20-year-old son, 46-year-old, that's not a new dad, all right? They've been a dad 20 years at least. The son went up to him in his fit of rage and just said, hey, could I get a new car? Doesn't seem like the wisest time in the world to ask for a car. Maybe he was trying to provoke his dad to wrath even more. I don't know the situation, but here's what happens next. The dad went and got his gun, his pistol, and pointed it at his son's head and fired it. The son barely moved his head out of the way, ran to a neighbor's house, and this 46-year-old dad was... that's the extreme of provoking our children to wrath. But let's not be dumb, parents. Let's take a step back. We're supposed to be the parents, right? We don't want to provoke them to wrath. And sometimes it's not necessarily being just absolutely foolishly over the top, but then maybe hypercriticalness is that way. Some parents are absolutely hypercritical when it comes to their children for whatever reasons it may be. Maybe because, they're afraid of their reputation being tarnished by how their kids are acting. None of us as parents, we like it when our kids just act up in public because we think, I don't need to act up that way. But sometimes we're overly critical of kids because we want them to, we're just living through them. It's like we have dreams and we want our kids to be the best baseball player on the planet, to be the best musician there ever was or is. And we can be hypercritical. It's okay to instruct our kids, to correct them when they're wrong. It's okay to teach them what is right even when they don't want to hear it. But hypercriticalness, that can damage a relationship between a parent and a child and cause the child... I'm thankful, Jeff, that I had a dad when I played sports all throughout high school. I had a dad, I think the worst criticism he ever gave me when I was playing baseball, for whatever reason, I remembered it from being like in the 5th grade. And he walks over to the dugout after I pop up, had an infield fly, just popped it up. I don't know if it was to third base or whatever. And he walked over to me and said, well, I guess you got under that one just a little bit, didn't you? That's about the most harsh my dad ever got with me. I'm not saying you can't be a little harsher than that. But do we really need parents saying, how could you swing at that? How could you miss that? Why didn't you catch that? Well, because we just tried not to? Is that what it is? Man, we don't need that. Let me tell you what else we don't need. And this is real serious, guys. Hypercriticalness or hypocriticalness. You want to listen, I saw this like I had never seen it before in one of my children. Let me just give you this example. I know our time's rapidly getting away, but I really thought of all the things we're going to deal with in this class, camping out on not provoking your children to wrath, I thought might be the one to camp out the most because it might be the one we neglect the most in a lot of our classes as we discipline them and instruct them in the ways of God. I may not get to that part of our class today, but you can drive your kids mad, literally, with your hypocrisy. My 2 sons, who now they're in their 20s, one's out of college, another one is about to hopefully graduate with his nursing degree, and hopefully he'll pass that NCLEX test. And I have a daughter who's a sophomore in college, and to this day, I suppose I'll never forget when my wife received a phone call from my middle child. After he and his older brother heard me speak to probably 500 or 600 people about the dangers of pornography and sexual immorality, and talking also about the dangers of soft porn, and probably even used the swimsuit, raised the topic of the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated or whatever. We used to get Sports Illustrated for years, and one of my sons loved being able to get it. But one thing I never saw in the house was the swimsuit issue. Didn't need to see it, but I'm just saying, like, I don't even know that I knew it came. And one day my son called my wife, and she said he was as agitated and upset as she can ever remember hearing him on the phone. He was about 13 years old, if I remember, maybe 14 at the time. And under my nightstand, that is where they charged their iPads at that time. Now, we tried to be careful, which is another thing about parenting. I would certainly consider us all, and you as parents maybe with younger children, to be careful at what age in life you give them an electronic device. When our kids had electronic devices, when they were old enough to handle certain ones, if I recall correctly, there were no phones at that time, but they had iPads with covenant eyes on there, so they could only reach the internet through this particular app that, tracked where they went and sent my wife a report every month. Now, again, we're not trying to, cause our children to be wrathful, but I want to give you this example. My son, when he went to go charge his iPad underneath our nightstand, because that's where they would charge at night, or that's where they had to be turned in at night, because we didn't let them have them in their rooms, he pulled out under my nightstand the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated. Remembering that I just heard Dad talk about this stuff a few months ago in front of hundreds of people, and you're telling me he's looking at this stuff, that he gets this stuff. He didn't call me, he called his mom. I mean, just ranting and raving. Well, in fact, he was so agitated he would not even tell her what was wrong. He said, I just can't even talk about it. My parents live behind me, and so she said she didn't know what it was. She thought maybe someone was trying to break into the house. That's how agitated he was. She didn't know if there was something else going on. So she said, go down to your grandparents, and when I get home, I will talk with you. And so when she got home, he let her know that Dad has been looking at the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated, and he is a hypocrite. And then his mother, thankfully, was able to tell him, Micah, your dad didn't put that there. He doesn't even know it's there. She said, normally when it comes in the mail, I get it and go burn it, literally. Like, I don't want my two sons or my husband looking at this, but I got it in the mail, and I was busy. I just put it under your dad's nightstand until I could burn it later. Like, of all the places in the house, you're going to put it under my nightstand. Let me just tell you, yeah, that was a real example for me. That, listen, your kids, I fully believe that young people, that children can spot a hypocritical parent faster than a blue tick hound can tree a coon. I mean, they can see hypocrisy. Now, we're not perfect parents, but let's be real, right? Let's be genuine. Let's be sincere, because our children can see it. I'd also say there's three things we've looked at. First was being just immaturely foolish and angry and bitter and cruel towards kids. Number two was being hypercritical. Number three was being hypocritical and really just dishonest. Isn't that what being fake is, really? And four, I would say, let's be sure not to show any favoritism among our kids. You want to drive one kid mad? You want to provoke them to wrath? Well, then don't play favorites with one or more of your children. That doesn't mean that everything that one child gets to do, another child gets to do at the same time, in the same place, in the same way. Life is different. Jesus taught us that with the apostles, right? You had Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. I'm not saying they were the only apostles, right? But they were kind of the inner circle of the apostles. I'm not saying you should have the inner circle of your children. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, though, that not everything is always going to be the exact same for every single child. The exact same is not necessarily not showing favoritism. And you remember at the end of the Gospel of John, God told Peter, in essence, how he was going to die. And Peter was like, well, what about him? Talking about the Apostle John. And Jesus said, what's that to you? What if he lives until I return? What's that to you? Don't worry about it. So we should teach our kids that just because I take one kid to a ball game this night does not mean I have to take the next kid to a ball game on the next night. But I do need to, across the board, not show favoritism toward any of our kids. You want to drive one kid crazy? Show favoritism. What I love about what we all ought to bask in when it comes to our God is not only His grace and His mercy and His love, but His fairness, His justice. The psalmist would say in Psalm 89 verse 14, I believe it is, that justice and fairness, righteousness and justice, they are the foundation of His throne. Let's not show favoritism with our kids. Let's not neglect them. Let's not neglect them. Let's be present for them. You want to hurt a kid? You want to provoke them to wrath? Then just don't ever be around, moms and dads. It is a noble thing for us to support our families, right? It's a noble thing. If a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. If a man doesn't work and provide for his family, he's worse than an infidel. We need to provide for our families, but we need to be there for our families. We need to be there for our spouses. We need to be there for our children. I don't think Tim would mind me using Tim Lewis, as an example, but you know where he was last night? He was here for a while, and I don't think he would mind me sharing this with you. He had a son that had a very, very important sporting event that was important to him. You know, Tim's going to be around here all weekend, but for a couple of hours there, he went to go support his son. You know, I was reading a book recently by John Gottman, Dr. John Gottman, who is one of America's foremost relationship experts. And the book was on marriage, husbands and wives. And he said, and I'm just summarizing this, you know what fuels marriages? You know what fuels marriages? Let me ask you this. Do you think it's the 2 weeks out of the year that someone takes a Bahamas vacation? Does that fuel a marriage? He said, no, listen, vacations are the icing on the cake. You know what the cake is, don't you? The cake is those thousands and thousands of little things that you do every day throughout the year for your families, for your wives, for your husbands. It's drinking a cup of coffee together on the back porch. It's holding hands, walking along, the riverbank, maybe where you live. It's taking a 15-minute drive to see a sunset. With your kids, it might be taking them to practice. It might be taking them to the emergency room to let the doctor try to fix a fractured hand or a broken collarbone or a broken ankle or all the many things that oftentimes happen with kids. Don't neglect your children, because neglect can bring about the worst in them. Let's bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord.